December 1941, Richmond, California. The Pacific air tastes of salt and smoke. Beneath the skeletal ribs of an unfinished ship, sparks fall like orange rain. Dozens of torches hiss in unison, cutting steel through the night. Every clang echoes across the bay, a new sound of war being born. Inside the shipyard, men and women move in rhythm. Housewives, students, farmers, now welders in overalls and goggles. The steel plates glow red hot as they fuse one after another, faster than anyone ever believed possible. Near the dock, a civilian in a soot-covered coat watches closely. He isn't a Navy officer or an engineer from Washington. He's a metalworker with a wild idea, a crazy shortcut that experts said would never hold under pressure. But the clock is running out. The Atlantic swallows Allied ships faster than America can build them. And in this factory of fire and urgency, one forgotten welding trick is about to defy everything the world thought it knew about time: steel and war. In the first years of the Second World War, the oceans became graveyards. German U-boats stalked the Atlantic like wolves, cutting off Britain's lifeline to food, fuel, and ammunition. Cargo ships sank by the dozens each week, sometimes within sight of shore. By 1941, the British were desperate. They needed ships faster than the Axis could sink them. But across the ocean, America was not yet ready for an industrial war. The U.S. merchant fleet was old and slow. Shipyards were small, scattered, and run by methods that hadn't changed since the First World War. Every vessel was built the old-fashioned way, by hand, one rivet at a time. A single cargo ship took more than 200 days to complete. Thousands of workers hammered each plate in place, an orchestra of clanging steel that moved painfully slow. America could build luxury liners and aircraft carriers, but not the plane. Sturdy workhorses needed to keep Britain alive. Then came the idea of the Liberty ship, a mass-producible cargo ship that could carry 10,000 tons of supplies and be built cheap, fast, and in huge numbers. The U.S. Maritime Commission called it a victory vessel. Critics called it a floating box. But the Allies didn't need elegance. They needed volume, hundreds, even thousands of ships, and they needed them yesterday. The government turned to industry for help. They needed someone to build ships who understood speed, not tradition. And so, unexpectedly, they found Henry J. Kaiser, a businessman who had never built a single ship in his life. Kaiser had been a construction tycoon, known for his work on massive projects like the Hoover Dam and Grand Coulee Dam. He knew concrete, not the sea, but what he did understand was systems, efficiency, flow, time. When the Maritime Commission asked him to help, he accepted without hesitation. At his first meeting with seasoned naval engineers, Kaiser proposed something radical. What if we treat shipbuilding like automobile manufacturing? The room fell silent. Shipyards were proud, centuries-old institutions. Ships weren't built, they were crafted. But Kaiser didn't care about romance. He cared about speed. He opened new shipyards on the West Coast, in Richmond, California, Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon, where he gathered an army of civilians. Thousands of men and women with no shipbuilding experience showed up, driven by patriotism and the promise of work. Instead of skilled riveters, he trained welders. Instead of handcrafting each piece, he broke ships into sections, prefabricated modules, that could be welded together like parts on an assembly line. But there was a problem. Welding, though faster, was unreliable. Poor welds could crack under stress. Navy officials feared these new Liberty ships might split apart at sea. The technique was crude, unstable, and dangerous. That's when one civilian stepped forward, a quiet, uncredited welder and metallurgist whose approach to joining steel seemed at first absurd. He proposed a welding trick that combined speed with strength, eliminating a critical step in the process. It went against standard training and Navy approval, yet in tests his seams held stronger than the old rivets. His name would fade from records, but his idea would not. Within months, it became the invisible backbone of America's greatest shipbuilding revolution. Under Kaiser's command, his innovation would turn shipyards into symphonies of fire, where time itself became a weapon. By early 1942, the world was at its breaking point. Pearl Harbor had dragged the United States into the war, and the Pacific and Atlantic now burned on both horizons. America faced a staggering truth. It didn't yet have the ships to fight a global war. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking supply convoys faster than they could be replaced. Japan dominated the Pacific sea lanes. Every ton of cargo lost meant fewer weapons, fewer rations, fewer chances for the Allies to survive another month. The answer had to come not from admirals or generals, but from engineers, welders, and workers standing in overalls beside steel hulls. In Washington, the Maritime Commission authorized the construction of hundreds of new shipyards. Yet only one man promised the impossible: Henry J. Kaiser. He told them he could build Liberty ships at speeds never seen before, not in months, but in weeks. Officials called it madness. Shipbuilding was an art, not a race. But Kaiser didn't see ships. He saw systems. He redesigned everything, from the layout of his shipyards to the rhythm of the work itself. His motto was simple: find it, fix it, make it faster. He brought in teams of engineers from Ford's assembly lines, experts from steel plants, and civilian metallurgists who had never seen the sea. One of them, an unassuming welder named Edward L. DeLong, according to later records, proposed something that would seem almost reckless. Traditional welding required a slow, layered process. Steel plates had to be cleaned, preheated, and cooled between passes. DeLong noticed that these pauses wasted hours each day, so he developed a continuous weld technique, a forgotten trick using controlled preheating and alternating torch angles. Instead of 3 welders spending a day on one seam, one welder could finish it in half the time with fewer flaws. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't patented, but it worked. When Kaiser's foremen tested it, they found something extraordinary. The welds were stronger, cleaner, and easier to inspect than rivets. And because each section of a Liberty ship could now be fused together rapidly, the bottleneck vanished. Meanwhile, Kaiser pushed morale and inclusion like no one else. His shipyards became laboratories of American diversity. Women, immigrants, and African-American laborers working side by side under floodlights. Posters read, "Speed the ship, speed the victory." Entire neighborhoods sprang up around the shipyards. Schools for welders ran 24 hours a day. Cafeterias fed thousands between shifts. At night, when the torches flared, the horizon looked like lightning trapped in steel. Still, critics waited for disaster. They called Kaiser's ships Kaiser's coffins. They said the welds would split apart in storms. Even the Navy doubted him. But Kaiser and his civilian team pressed forward, confident that DeLong's continuous welding method could hold against the Atlantic's worst. By the end of 1942, the results silenced the skeptics. Liberty ships began to roll out of Richmond and Portland in record time. What had taken 7 months now took less than 2 weeks. Each new ship was a statement, a floating factory of democracy, built by people who had never before touched the sea. And as the first 100 Liberty ships joined the convoys across the Atlantic, even the Germans took notice. A captured U-boat commander later told interrogators, "We sank them by the dozen, and still they came by the 100. America had found its tempo. And it was the tempo of fire, steel, and a forgotten trick that changed industrial history. The miracle of the Liberty ship was not born from brilliance alone. It was born from necessity, and from the collision of human will with industrial power. To understand how one welding trick changed the war, we have to see it through 3 lenses: technology, humanity, and industry. The technological angle. Welding over riveting for centuries. Ships were built with rivets, tens of thousands of small steel bolts hammered through overlapping plates. It was slow, expensive, and demanded an army of skilled hands. Each rivet had to be heated, driven, and inspected. But during war, time itself became a resource as valuable as steel or oil. Welding was faster, but it was also unpredictable. When welds cracked, ships broke in half. Early tests in the 1930s had ended in failure. The Navy distrusted it, calling it a shortcut for amateurs. But Kaiser's team didn't ask for permission. They experimented. They tested welds under stress and cold. They learned that with proper heat control and plate alignment, welded joints were not just equal to rivets, they were stronger. Edward L. DeLong's continuous weld method, preheating seams and using alternating arcs, eliminated microfractures and warping. His approach replaced hours of preparation with a flowing process that fused steel almost seamlessly. For the first time in maritime history, the hull of a ship could be joined in hours instead of days. To welders, it felt like magic. To the Navy, it looked like mass production. To the enemy, it would soon look like an endless fleet rising from the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. The human angle. The untrained Army Kaiser's shipyards were not filled with sailors or engineers. They were filled with ordinary Americans who had never seen a ship before the war. Housewives, farmers, and high school graduates became the hands that built the largest maritime force in history. Among them were thousands of women, nicknamed Wendy the welders, counterparts to the iconic Rosie the riveters. They stood shoulder to shoulder with men, their faces lit by the glow of torches, their gloves black with soot. In Richmond, 25% of the workforce were women. Another 10% were African American men and women, many working skilled trades for the first time. Kaiser believed ability mattered more than background, and he proved it. Productivity rose, morale soared, and turnover plummeted. But it wasn't easy. The heat was unbearable. Sparks burned through fabric and skin. One misstep could ruin a section or cause a fire. Yet they worked without complaint, knowing that every inch of welded steel meant one more ship carrying tanks, food, and medicine across U-boat-infested waters. Each worker became part of a greater rhythm. 3 shifts, day and night, 7 days a week. The torch never went cold. When one crew left, another arrived, stepping into the same footprints, continuing the same line of weld. There were no medals, no promotions, only speed and pride. Kaiser's shipyards were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Instead of open docks, he built massive covered bays where weather no longer slowed work. Instead of crafting 1 ship at a time, he built 10, side by side. Every piece of a Liberty ship was prefabricated. The bow, stern deck, and engine block, built in separate workshops, moved by cranes and joined like puzzle pieces. Welding teams stood ready at every station, applying DeLong's continuous process to seal the seams. The system ran like clockwork. Supplies came by rail. Tools and torches were standardized. When one section finished, another began. It wasn't a shipyard anymore. It was a conveyor belt of war. Kaiser didn't just build ships. He built a blueprint for modern mass production. From his model, American aircraft factories learned modular design. Tank plants learned just-in-time logistics. Even post-war industries, cars, appliances, steel, would copy his approach. But in 1942, none of that mattered yet. The only thing that mattered was numbers. And as welders pushed their torches through the night, they were turning out something more than steel. They were forging momentum, a momentum that would overwhelm the Axis before the decade was done. The world had entered an era where victory wasn't just fought with bullets, but built with sparks. The Liberty ship story cannot be told through blueprints alone. It is a web of human effort, enemy observation, and moral conviction, each angle revealing a different truth about what made this forgotten trick more than just a technical success. The enemy angle. Ugly, but endless to the German Navy, the Liberty ship became a nightmare of arithmetic. Every time a U-boat commander sent one to the bottom, 2 more seemed to appear on the horizon. The Kriegsmarine's early dominance depended on scarcity, on the Allies' inability to replace what was lost. But now, replacements came faster than torpedoes could sink them. Intercepted reports in 1943 described German disbelief. The Americans produce ships faster than we can find them. One U-boat officer captured off the coast of Norway admitted, "They build them as if from paper, but they come without end." The welded hulls, simple and modular, lacked the elegance of European design. They were angular, crude, and utilitarian, but they were built for one purpose: to survive long enough to deliver their cargo. And they did. Even as some Liberty ships cracked in polar waters in a result of rushed production and brittle steel, their speed of replacement made loss irrelevant. In the cold logic of total war, America had created something new, a weapon of quantity. The moral angle, the factory as a front line, while soldiers bled on beaches and airmen fought over Europe, the men and women at Kaiser's yards waged their own kind of battle. Every worker knew their torch was a rifle, their hours were bullets, their fatigue was sacrifice. Kaiser introduced innovations beyond steel. He built childcare centers, on-site hospitals and cafeterias that served 10,000 meals a day. He believed that comfort increased output, that dignity produced endurance. It was a quiet revolution inside the war effort. Industrial democracy at scale, and it worked. Absenteeism dropped. Morale soared. Productivity broke records. In Richmond alone, crews launched more than 700 ships between 1941 and 1945, a number no other shipyard in history had matched. When the first Liberty ship completed using DeLong's continuous weld launched ahead of schedule, the crowd didn't cheer for a ship. They cheered for themselves, for proof that the impossible could be done by ordinary people in ordinary cities, armed with nothing more than will. The logistical angle, how speed won the Atlantic. The true power of the Liberty ship wasn't its armor or its guns, it was its frequency. Each ship carried about 10,000 tons of cargo: tanks, aircraft, food, ammunition, fuel, and even entire locomotives. Once production accelerated, the U.S. could send thousands of tons of supplies across the Atlantic every single day. In 1941, Britain had fewer than 2 million tons of shipping available. By 1944, thanks to Liberty ships, that number exceeded 13 million. Convoys grew larger, escorts more coordinated, and the once invincible U-boat threat began to collapse under sheer volume. It wasn't luck. It was math. Kaiser's welding revolution cut construction time by over 50%, freeing labor, materials, and shipways for other projects. Factories that once built 2 ships a year were now launching 1 every week. Even President Roosevelt took notice. When told of a ship completed in under 5 days, he reportedly smiled and said, "Good, now see if we can make it 4. And they did. In November 1942, the SS Robert E. Peary was built, assembled and launched in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, a feat still unmatched in maritime history. That ship became a symbol not of arrogance, but of American resolve. A floating reminder that when pressed to its limits, a democracy could outproduce an empire. The philosophical angle, the power of the unseen. In every war, there are the visible heroes, generals, soldiers and strategists, and the unseen ones, who change history quietly. The welder's torch doesn't sound like victory. It doesn't roar like an engine or thunder like artillery. But in that silent spark, history turned. Edward L. DeLong never received medals or honors. His method appeared in manuals and training guides, but his name faded in the paperwork. The world moved on. Yet, decades later, every modern ship still relies on variations of his technique: continuous, efficient, seamless. In this, his legacy endures. His forgotten trick was not merely a shortcut. It was a symbol of what America became during the war, a nation that could turn individual ingenuity into collective strength. And while the world's attention was fixed on the battlefields, the true engine of victory was running quietly, in the shipyards, where sparks rained like fire across the night. In mid-1943, the shipyards of America were no longer just factories. They were the front lines of production warfare. Every torch strike, every crane swing, every shift bell became part of a military rhythm as critical as any artillery barrage in Europe. At Richmond Yard No. 2, welders stood shoulder to shoulder across half-finished hulls, sparks reflecting off the black waters of San Francisco Bay. The heat was constant, the noise unending, a metallic heartbeat that pulsed day and night. And presiding over it all was Henry J. Kaiser, wearing his white hard hat and stopwatch, pacing between gantries like a general on campaign. He was obsessed with time. A shipyard clock counted not hours but days saved. In the first months, a Liberty ship required 230 days. By spring 1943, Kaiser's teams were doing it in 30, then 20. The impossible goal was 5. Kaiser called for an experiment, a full-scale test of human endurance and industrial precision. The challenge: build an entire Liberty ship from keel to launch in less than 5 days, using every advantage the new continuous welding method could offer. The ship chosen would be the SS Robert E. Peary. Day 1, keel to skeleton. The whistle blew at dawn, November 8, 1942. Crews poured in from every corner of Richmond: 250 welders, 1,000 fitters, 200 laborers, and hundreds of crane operators. Prefabricated hull sections, already shaped and drilled, were rolled in by rail cars. DeLong's continuous weld teams took their stations at the seams. Within hours, the keel, the spine of the ship, was complete. Cranes lifted bulkheads into place and torches stitched the steel together in orange arcs. Reporters watched from a raised platform, writing furiously, their faces lit by molten light. Day 2. The hull rises. By noon the next day, the Peary had grown from skeleton to shape. The speed defied belief. One foreman remarked, "We're not building a ship, we're pouring it." Kaiser's supervisors enforced a rhythm measured to the minute. Trucks delivered sections just as cranes cleared their previous loads. Each weld was inspected on the spot. No rework, no delay. The DeLong technique held perfectly. No cracks, no slag, no warping. When the night shift took over, music from a portable radio echoed across the yard. Glenn Miller, faint but steady, mixing with the roar of acetylene. Day 3. The deck and superstructure. On the third day, the deckhouse and engine casing were hoisted into place. Women welders, many still teenagers, crawled beneath steel girders to finish the underdeck seams. Sweat turned to steam on their gloves. Some had been awake for nearly 20 hours, working overtime voluntarily. At dawn, Kaiser climbed a scaffolding to inspect the progress. The ship stretched across the dock like a steel whale. "Keep going," he said simply. "She sails this week." Day 4. The test of the welds. The final 24 hours were the most dangerous. The welded seams would face their first trial as the hull cooled and contracted. Any weakness would split open before launch. Inspectors moved methodically, tapping seams with hammers, listening for hollow echoes. None came. The welds held, smooth and unbroken, as if the ship had been cast in a single pour. As the last plates were sealed, a cold wind blew from the bay, scattering sparks into the water. The clock read 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The Peary was ready. The launch crowds gathered along the pier. Workers who hadn't slept in days stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces streaked with soot and pride. Flags whipped in the wind. A whistle sounded and the chocks were struck away. The massive hull slid down the greased ways and thundered into the Pacific with a roar that drowned the crowd's cheer. Reporters described it as a miracle in steel. The continuous weld seams glistened under the gray sky. Flawless, unbroken, alive. The ship floated steady, perfect. Henry Kaiser didn't smile. He only checked his watch, nodded once, and said, "Let's make another." The record was official, a complete Liberty ship, built from keel to sea in under 5 days. Proof that America's industrial heart could move faster than any empire's army. And somewhere in the noise of celebration, a single welder, the man whose trick made it possible, quietly hung up his gloves and walked home. Anonymous but victorious, the impossible had been done. But now came the question, could this speed hold when scaled to the entire war? The launch of the SS Robert E. Peary echoed across the Allied world. Newspapers called it the ship that defied time. The New York Times hailed Kaiser's shipyard as the 8th wonder of the world. To a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor, it was more than a technical victory. It was proof that America could outthink, outbuild, and outlast its enemies. But behind the headlines, the real transformation was just beginning. The Peary was not a stunt. It was a blueprint. Kaiser immediately implemented the same continuous welding and modular assembly techniques across all his yards. The results were staggering. By the summer of 1943, 16 Liberty ships a week were being launched from American docks. By 1944, that number doubled. Entire convoys left San Francisco and Portland bound for the Pacific, while others streamed from Baltimore and New Orleans toward Europe. The Allies were no longer just replenishing losses. They were flooding the oceans with steel. From experiment to standard at first, traditional shipbuilders scoffed. They called it factory steel, claiming that welded ships lacked the craftsmanship of riveted ones. Some early models even suffered fractures in cold seas, earning the cruel nickname Kaiser's coffins. But metallurgists quickly adapted, improving the steel composition and reinforcing critical joints. When the U.S. Navy tested the repaired vessels, they found the hulls performed flawlessly under stress. The failures were rare, the successes overwhelming. The continuous weld method became the new standard, not just for Liberty ships, but for destroyers, landing craft, and even tank carriers. It was faster, cheaper, and safer. Every ship launched carried the unseen signature of that forgotten trick. The process was now taught in manuals, replicated in yards from Mobile to Vancouver. Even Britain adopted the technique, accelerating their own production lines. A world watching across the Atlantic, German intelligence took notice. Reports to the Oberkommando der Marine, the German naval command, and described an American shipbuilding miracle. U-boat commanders complained that sinkings no longer mattered. Report captured from a sunken submarine read, "For every ship we destroy, 2 more appear." The Americans build ships faster than the sea can swallow them. Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the U-boat fleet, understood the meaning before his subordinates did. His entire campaign, the Battle of the Atlantic, relied on attrition. But now attrition no longer worked. America's shipyards had become weapons factories disguised as docks. Each day that passed meant another dozen ships launched, another 1,000 miles of supply lines secured. Allied convoys that had once sailed thin and vulnerable now traveled in massive, escorted groups, a steel river crossing 2 oceans. The Liberty ship, crude and slow though it was, had turned the tide of logistics. Human endurance, the real miracle in the shipyards, fatigue became the enemy. Crews worked in 3 shifts around the clock, living on coffee, cigarettes, and adrenaline. Sparks rained endlessly, 24 hours of light. Kaiser understood the toll and responded with something radical for wartime: America, healthcare. He introduced one of the world's first prepaid medical systems for his workers, Kaiser Permanente, ensuring that anyone injured on the job or exhausted from overwork could recover without losing wages. It was unheard of in the 1940s, but it kept the shipyards running. He also built housing villages, nurseries, and canteens, turning industrial zones into communities. Each new welder trained, each family fed, became another cog in the grand machinery of survival. For many, it wasn't just work. It was patriotism in its purest form. As one welder recalled decades later, "We weren't just making ships. We were making victory, one seam at a time." The moment the tide turned in 1943, Allied losses in the Atlantic finally began to drop. Convoys arrived intact. Britain's ports, once starved of supplies, overflowed with food and fuel. The German U-boat fleet, once the terror of the seas, began to wither under the combined weight of radar, depth charges, and most of all, sheer American output. At the same time, in the Pacific, Liberty ships carried tanks and trucks to new island campaigns: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan. Each ship meant another advance, another foothold. The Allies were no longer fighting to survive. They were preparing to win. And at the heart of this industrial miracle was a small innovation, a welding trick devised by a civilian no one remembered by name. His process didn't just save time. It reshaped the rhythm of the war. When Henry Kaiser was later asked how he did it, he didn't talk about blueprints or contracts. He simply said, "We believed it could be done, so we did it." By 1945, the U.S. had produced 2,110 Liberty ships, each one a product of sparks, sweat, and belief. They weren't beautiful. They weren't fast, but they were enough. And in total war, enough was the most powerful word in the world. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world that emerged from the smoke was held together, quite literally, by Liberty ships. Across both oceans, the Allied victory had floated on their decks. From the deserts of North Africa to the beaches of Normandy, from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Pacific, they had carried everything an army needed to live, move, and fight. In total, 10 Liberty ships were built, an industrial feat unmatched before or since. The average construction time fell from 230 days to just 42, and in some cases under a week. Every ship bore the stamp of Kaiser's vision and the unseen influence of the welder's continuous technique. It was no longer a crazy idea. It had become the foundation of Allied logistics, a method copied by Britain, Canada, and even post-war Japan. Each ship was a floating symbol of what democracy could do when pushed to its limits: rough, unadorned, and effective. They were not designed to last decades, yet some did. In the post-war years, hundreds were converted into merchant vessels, grain carriers, even hospitals. Others were sold to private companies for pennies on the dollar, continuing to serve into the 1960s. But for many Americans, the Liberty ship represented something deeper, a triumph of ordinary people over impossible odds. Welders, riveters, foremen, and clerks had built them not for profit but for purpose. In Kaiser's shipyards, unity had been forged from chaos. Men and women of every color and background had worked side by side beneath the same sparks, chasing the same deadline. In interviews years later, workers recalled not the exhaustion or the danger, but the pride. One said, "I wasn't on the front line, but I knew I was part of something that would change the world." And they were right. The innovations that powered Kaiser's empire of steel did not vanish when peace returned. They spread outward, to car factories, airplane plants, construction sites. The concept of modular assembly, continuous flow, and cross-trained labor became the backbone of post-war American industry. The world's highways, skyscrapers, and commercial ships would all trace their lineage back to those West Coast shipyards, where time was conquered and steel was tamed. Even Henry Kaiser himself carried those lessons forward. After the war, he turned his attention to peacetime projects, cars, housing, medicine, using the same formula of speed and mass production. The company health plan he introduced for his workers during the Liberty Ship days evolved into Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare systems in the United States. And yet, for all the accolades and memorials, one story slipped quietly through history's cracks. The story of the civilian who had made the breakthrough that started it all. His name faded from public record. His welding technique became standard practice, absorbed by manuals and factories worldwide. The world forgot the man, but remembered his spark. That anonymous innovation, born of necessity, perfected under pressure, had saved not just days or months, but millions of lives by ensuring the flow of supplies never stopped. What began as one man's forgotten trick had become one of the most decisive industrial weapons in human history. By the war's end, the scale of America's shipbuilding miracle left even its architects astonished. In total, the United States had launched over 5,000 merchant and naval vessels, more than every Axis shipyard combined. The Liberty ship was no longer just a cargo carrier. It was a symbol of industrial democracy, a floating testament to what free people could accomplish when bound by a common cause. In 1946, reporters visiting Kaiser's now quiet shipyards found them eerily still. The furnaces cold, the cranes silent, the torches extinguished. Rows of empty hulls lay in dry dock waiting for conversion or scrap. The war that had demanded so much speed had suddenly stopped, and with it the heartbeat of the shipyards. But their legacy had already sailed far beyond those waters. In Britain, shipbuilders adopted the American continuous weld process to rebuild their devastated merchant fleets. In Japan, post-war reconstruction efforts leaned heavily on modular assembly, the very principle Kaiser had pioneered. The Soviet Union studied captured Liberty ships and reverse-engineered their designs, adopting the same efficient methods in their naval yards. Even in peacetime, the Liberty ships continued to serve quietly. They hauled grain across the Atlantic during famine relief efforts, transported refugees after the war, and became classrooms for maritime academies training the next generation of sailors. Many of them were renamed, stripped of their wartime identities, painted over, and absorbed into civilian life. Yet every one of them carried the story of the welders who had built them, inch by inch, seam by seam. Henry Kaiser received international praise, but he never claimed personal glory. When asked about the secret behind his shipyard's success, he famously replied, "It wasn't me, it was the people. Give them the tools and they'll build the future." He meant it literally. His belief in human potential, in the ability of untrained citizens to master complex trades, became the model for post-war vocational education. Universities and technical schools began teaching the Kaiser system, teamwork, modular efficiency, and continuous improvement, principles that would later define the American century. As for Edward L. DeLong and other innovators like him, history did not preserve their names with the same care. Their patents were absorbed by the U.S. Maritime Commission, their notes filed away in government archives. But their fingerprints were everywhere, in every seamless hull, every tanker, every naval frigate built in the decades that followed. By the 1950s, the methods they pioneered had become global standard, from the oil tankers of Rotterdam to the destroyers of Yokosuka. Welding had permanently replaced riveting. The world had changed its very definition of how steel met steel. In 1973, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, one of the last surviving Liberty ships, was rescued from the scrapyard and restored. When her engines roared back to life, veterans wept. The smell of hot oil and the groan of her hull carried them back to that furious decade when time was the enemy and steel was salvation. When she sailed again, under her own power, across the Golden Gate, it was not just a ship returning to sea. It was a memory, made solid and floating once more. The Liberty ship had been born from fear and urgency, built in haste and fire, and forged by hands that had never before touched steel. Yet its endurance, both physical and symbolic, proved something profound, that in the darkest moments of history, progress is rarely led by generals but by those who build quietly behind them. The war ended with medals and parades, but history's truest monument stood in the waters, simple gray, and welded from the will of millions. And somewhere within each of those 2,610 hulls was a single spark, passed from one welder's torch to another, a reminder that even the smallest idea, when shared and refined, can change the course of the world. The story of the Liberty ship is not a tale of war alone. It is a story of transformation. It tells how fear became invention, how chaos became rhythm, and how a single idea, dismissed, doubted, almost forgotten, reshaped the world's understanding of what human hands could achieve. When people speak of the Second World War, they often remember the battles, Midway, Normandy, Stalingrad. But between every battle was a bridge of steel, stretching across oceans built by those who never saw the front lines. Without them, no army could have advanced, no fleet could have sailed, no victory could have endured. The Liberty ship was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to exist, to endure, to move supplies through storm and fire, and yet in its plainness it became beautiful, because it symbolized the unity of a people who refused to surrender to time. The forgotten welder's trick, simple and efficient, carried an unspoken lesson. Progress is often born not in laboratories or boardrooms, but in the heat of necessity, when ordinary minds see what experts overlook. In every flicker of that welding torch lay the quiet defiance of democracy, a belief that ingenuity belongs to everyone, that a student, a farmer, or a factory worker can change the destiny of nations. When the SS Robert E. Peary slid into the Pacific in just over 4 days, it wasn't just a ship being launched, it was an idea setting sail. An idea that speed and precision, when united with purpose, can alter history itself. Decades later, the world still builds with welded seams, still echoes with the legacy of that flame. The torch that once burned in Kaiser's shipyards now burns in every workshop and factory where creation defies limitation. And so, the Liberty ship remains more than a relic. It is a testament that in the face of impossible odds, a spark of human will can become an ocean of strength.